Have you ever wondered what secrets lie buried in the footnotes of history? We often think of the past as a settled story, a series of events with clear beginnings and clear endings. But what if there are chapters that were deliberately torn out, stories so disturbing, so difficult to confront that entire nations conspired to forget them? Yet history has its dark corners, its locked rooms where uncomfortable truths are hidden away. What if I told you about an experiment so chilling, its name alone sends a shiver down your spine? An experiment not conducted in a sterile modern laboratory, but in the brutal, unforgiving wilderness of a world at war. This isn't a tale of fiction. This is the story of Experiment 625, a name that rarely appears in textbooks. It represents a systematic, cold-blooded effort to push the human body to its absolute limit, and then beyond. It's a story about science twisted into a tool of suffering, where the pursuit of knowledge became a justification for unimaginable cruelty. The silence surrounding it is almost as deafening as the acts themselves, raising the question, why have we not heard this story before? The narrative of World War II is vast and complex, filled with heroism and horror. The journey into this past is dark, but it is a journey we must take. So, what exactly was Experiment 625? It was a code name for a series of brutal human experiments focused on frostbite and hypothermia. The project was carried out by a clandestine branch of the Imperial Japanese Army during the height of the Second World War. Specifically, these tests took place between the winter of 1942 and early 1945. The location was as cruel as the experiment itself. A remote, purpose-built facility deep within the snow-laden forests of northern Manchuria. This wasn't some rogue operation. It was a state-sanctioned program, meticulously planned and executed by some of Japan's brightest medical minds and military officers who believed they were serving their emperor. The official objective was chillingly pragmatic. The Japanese military was engaged in brutal winter campaigns, particularly against Soviet forces in Siberia and northern China. They were losing thousands of soldiers, not to bullets, but to the relentless, biting cold. The High Command wanted answers. They needed to understand how to prevent frostbite, how to treat it effectively, and how to acclimate their troops to survive in sub-zero conditions. Experiment 625 was designed to provide that data. The individuals who orchestrated this horror were not faceless monsters. They were educated men, doctors and scientists under the command of officers like Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, the notorious director of Unit 731. The key figures were medical researchers who had sworn an oath to do no harm, yet they justified their actions as a patriotic duty. The prisoners they used were not seen as human beings but as maruda, the Japanese word for logs, raw material to be used and discarded for the sake of data. What happened inside Compound 625 was meant to stay inside Compound 625, a frozen secret buried under layers of snow and silence. The subjects of Experiment 625 were not volunteers. They were prisoners of war and civilians abducted from the surrounding regions. The majority were Chinese, Korean, Mongolian, Russian. These were not soldiers captured on the battlefield. Many were simply civilians, farmers, intellectuals, political dissidents, resistance fighters, rounded up by the Kempeitai. They were chosen for their disposability. Their disappearance would not be questioned, stripped of their names, stripped of their identities, stripped of their humanity, assigned numbers, mere data points in a ghastly ledger. Methods were systematic and devoid of compassion. The process of inducing frostbite was horrifically straightforward. Taken outside in the dead of winter, often naked or with minimal clothing, forced to stand for hours, limbs sometimes submerged in barrels of icy water. Researchers prodded arms and legs with bayonets or small hammers until frozen solid, a sound like a block of wood when struck. The goal, study progression in meticulous detail. They documented everything: time to freeze, stages of tissue death, onset of gangrene. Once a limb was thoroughly frozen, the thawing phase began. This was where research became even more perverse. Scientists tested rewarming techniques for effectiveness, not mercy. Frozen limbs plunged into boiling water, others exposed to dry heat close to open fires. In some cases, limbs left to thaw at room temperature, slow necrosis observed while subjects remained conscious. The suffering was unimaginable. Prisoners endured physical agony and psychological terror, trapped in a living nightmare surrounded by screams knowing their turn would come. For researchers, this was science, a production line of death, meticulously documented in the name of imperial science. Due to the extreme secrecy and the high mortality rate at Compound 625, first-hand survivor accounts are exceptionally rare, almost non-existent. Most of what we know comes from the post-war confessions of the Japanese researchers themselves, who were granted immunity by the Allied forces in exchange for their data. However, a few fragmented stories have surfaced over the decades. One such account speaks of a young Chinese woman, referred to only as Subject 421, who was a captured resistance fighter. She was forced to hold her newborn baby outside until the infant froze to death, after which the researchers studied her psychological response to the trauma. Another story, extracted from the confession of a junior medical assistant, describes the ordeal of 3 Russian prisoners of war. They were driven to a frozen field, stripped naked, and doused with water from a fire hose. The researchers, bundled in heavy winter coats, watched from a heated observation post as the men slowly turned into human ice sculptures. One of the men, in a final act of defiance, tried to run towards the electrified fence before collapsing. The purpose of this particular test was to determine the precise time it took for a healthy adult male to die from hypothermia in windy conditions. The assistant's testimony was delivered in a flat, emotionless tone, as if recalling a routine laboratory procedure. One of the most haunting descriptions comes not from a victim, but from a guard who later testified at the Soviet trials. He spoke of the unfreezing room, a place of constant, agonizing screams. He recalled one man, a captured Chinese academic who remained eerily silent throughout the procedure of having his frozen hands immersed in near-boiling water. The guard said the man simply stared at the researchers with an expression of profound silent contempt until he lost consciousness from the pain. This story highlights the immense psychological fortitude of some victims in the face of absolute evil. These fragments, though horrifying, give a human face to the statistics. They transform the abstract notion of human experimentation into a gallery of individual suffering. They are the echoes of voices that were systematically silenced, and they demand to be heard, ensuring that the victims are remembered not as Maruta, but as human beings who endured the unendurable. Experiment 625 did not exist in a vacuum. It was an integral, though lesser-known component of the vast and monstrous network of the Imperial Japanese Army's Biological and Chemical Warfare Division, officially known as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army, Unit 731. Based in the Pingfang district of Harbin, Manchuria, Unit 731 was the heart of Japan's dark science program. It was a sprawling complex where thousands of prisoners were subjected to vivisection without anesthesia, infected with plague, infected with cholera, infected with anthrax, used as living targets for new bombs. The horrors of Unit 731 were on a scale that almost defies belief. Experiment 625 can be understood as a specialized satellite program of Unit 731. While the main facility at Pingfang focused primarily on bacteriological warfare, other smaller, more specialized units were established to research different military challenges. Experiment 625 was the Frostbite Division. The personnel flowed directly from the high command of Unit 731. General Shiro Ishii himself visited the Frostbite research facility to observe its progress. The same chillingly detached scientific methodology was used across these facilities. The same dehumanizing language, referring to human subjects as logs, appears in documents. The connection contextualizes the cold exposure tests within a broader campaign of state-sponsored war crimes. This was not the work of a few rogue sadists. This was systematic. This was well-organized. This was a well-funded national project. Research from Experiment 625 on causing and treating frostbite was compiled and sent back to military medical schools in Japan. Data gathered from Chinese prisoners. Data gathered from Russian prisoners. That data was intended to protect Japanese soldiers. This created a disturbing moral calculus where one group's lives were sacrificed for another. After Japan's surrender in 1945, many key figures were secretly granted immunity from prosecution by the United States. In exchange, they handed over vast troves of research data. American military intelligence sought the results to gain advantage in the Cold War against the Soviet Union. The deal meant the men who froze and dissected people largely escaped justice. Many went on to careers in post-war Japan's medical establishments, academic establishments, and business establishments. The story of Experiment 625, much like the broader history of Unit 731, was deliberately suppressed for decades. One of the primary reasons for this silence was the post-war political climate. The United States, in a calculated act of realpolitik, chose to prioritize acquiring the Japanese research data over prosecuting the perpetrators. The American government actively concealed the extent of these war crimes, classifying the files and swearing the involved Japanese scientists to secrecy. The Cold War had begun. The data on hypothermia, bacteriological agents, and human endurance was deemed too valuable to be made public, especially if it meant it would also fall into the hands of the Soviets. Justice was traded for intelligence. Within Japan itself, a powerful and pervasive culture of denial took hold. The subject of wartime atrocities was, and to some extent remains, deeply taboo. For a nation rebuilding itself from the ashes of total defeat, confronting such a monstrous past was an uncomfortable and shameful prospect. The government, the educational system, and even popular culture largely avoided the topic. To this day, the Japanese government has never fully and formally acknowledged the extent of these human experiments, often downplaying them or referring to them in ambiguous terms, much to the anger of neighboring countries like China and South Korea. Another significant factor was the location and the victims. The experiments took place in occupied Manchuria, a region that saw immense turmoil after the war. The victims were predominantly Chinese and Russian, and for a long time their voices were drowned out by the dominant Western narrative of the war. While the Nuremberg trials prosecuted Nazi atrocities in great detail, the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal largely overlooked the crimes of Unit 731 and its related projects. The Soviet Union did conduct its own trial, the Khabarovsk War Crimes Trials in 1949, where some lower-level personnel confessed, but this was largely dismissed in the West as communist propaganda during the Cold War. Finally, the sheer horror of the story makes it difficult to tell and to hear. Without a face like Anne Frank or a place as infamous as Auschwitz, the story of Experiment 625 remained an abstract horror, a footnote easily lost in the overwhelming scale of World War II's tragedies. Today, the ice of silence that has encased the history of Experiment 625 is slowly beginning to thaw. Thanks to the tireless work of historians, activists, descendants of victims, the story is emerging from the shadows. The declassification of documents, the translation of trial records, the brave testimony of a few aging participants have helped piece together this horrific puzzle. The legacy of Experiment 625 is a stark and powerful reminder when scientific inquiry is divorced from morality, when human beings are reduced to mere objects for study. It forces us to confront the darkest capabilities of human nature, even within fields we associate with progress and healing. The most important lesson we must draw from this history is the absolute necessity of universal human rights. The concept that every individual possesses inherent dignity and cannot be used as a means to an end is our strongest defense against such atrocities recurring. The Nuremberg Code, the set of research ethics principles for human experimentation created in the wake of Nazi medical crimes, was a direct response to this kind of perversion of science. The story of Experiment 625 reinforces every one of its principles, especially the paramount importance of voluntary and informed consent. It reminds us that no military objective or scientific goal can ever justify the torture and murder of a single human being. The legacy also carries a profound lesson about national memory and historical accountability. The decades of denial and suppression have not erased the facts. They have only delayed the inevitable and painful process of reconciliation. For true healing to occur, there must be a full and honest acknowledgement of the past, no matter how shameful. This is not about assigning collective guilt to new generations, but about creating a collective memory that honors the victims and ensures that such crimes are never forgotten or repeated. The ongoing disputes over textbooks and official apologies show that this process is far from complete, and that the ghosts of Experiment 625 still haunt international relations in East Asia. Ultimately, remembering Experiment 625 is an act of profound moral responsibility. It is our duty to listen to the whispers from history's darkest rooms, to give voice to the silenced, and to learn the lessons they have to teach us. The cold may have preserved the secrets of Compound 625 for a time, but it could not extinguish the truth. As we uncover these stories, we are reminded that vigilance, empathy, and an unwavering commitment to human rights are not abstract ideals. They are the essential guardrails of civilization. The frozen fields of Manchuria hold a warning that we must never, ever forget.